We don't serve veterans here anymore.
We don't serve veterans here
The woman's
anymore.
voice cut through the still morning air like a blade tearing the calm that had always blanketed Willow Lake. John Matthews, a former Navy SEAL, his calloused hands steady as he baited the hook, froze mid-motion. The water reflected his face, quiet, composed, untouched by anger. Karen Westfield, the new owner of the lake, walked toward him. Her polished sunglasses mirrored the image of the old man and his faded jacket so worn that the Navy insignia had almost vanished into the fabric. Pack up your stuff. This is a premium lake now. John looked up, his tone calm and even. I've fished here for 20 years, ma'am. She smirked. Then it's 20 years too long. Veterans bring down the atmosphere. The wind seemed to stop. A few nearby fishermen lowered their heads, pretending to adjust their rods. Karen stepped closer, snatched a bottle of water from the table, and splashed it straight into John's face. Now you understand you're not welcome here. Cold water streamed down the old man's face, catching the sunlight in tiny flashes like fragments of broken memories. John said nothing. He simply reeled in the line, each movement slow and deliberate, the same precision he once used to disassemble a rifle. Without a word, he turned and walked away, his heavy steps pressing deep into the damp grass, each footprint a quiet note of dignity. If you believe that true courage is not found in the sound of gunfire, but in the silence of those who have walked through war, subscribe to brave veteran stories and join us in preserving the memory, the dignity, and the reverence owed to our silent heroes. The next morning, mist hung low over the lake, spreading slowly like the breath of memory. John's old pickup truck stopped by the entrance, its paint dull and dotted with rust. The engine idled softly, steady and low, like the weary heartbeat of a man who had traveled too far down the road of duty. On the passenger seat, there was no fishing rod this time, only a small wooden box. The dark grain of the wood was worn smooth with age. John placed his calloused hand on the lid, his fingertips tracing the faintly carved letters, Ryan Matthews, U.S. Marine Corps. Ryan. It's been 5 years, he murmured, his voice dissolving like smoke in the cold, damp air. No one heard him, only the soft hum of the truck, the gentle slap of water against the sandy bank, and the sighing wind through the willow trees. John sat still, eyes fixed on the water. It was there he had once taught his son to cast a line, had laughed. When the boy caught his first fish, had saluted proudly the day Ryan put on his desert-colored Marine uniform. Those images lived now only in his memory, but they were sharper than anything before him. He opened the door. The hinge creaked softly, the sound slicing through the quiet like a farewell. His old boots sank into the dew-soaked grass. The air smelled of earth-wet wood and time. Every step he took was a small battle between the pride of a soldier and the ache of a father. At the edge of the lake, the surface was smooth as glass. He knelt beside a willow tree, setting the box gently on the ground. His hands trembled slightly as he brushed away the beads of dew that clung to its lid. Son, he whispered, I'm sorry. I wasn't angry yesterday, just sad. The place where you rest, they see me as a burden there. His voice caught, but his eyes remained calm. The kind of calm that belongs only to those who have faced death too many times to fear it. A kingfisher dove across the lake, touched the water, then vanished into the sky, leaving behind a single ripple that spread wide and disappeared. John followed it with his gaze, his lips moving faintly. Just like you, Ryan. You flew away, but you left your mark here. He smiled, the quiet smile of a man long familiar with loss. In the distance, a few familiar fishermen were packing up their gear. They saw him, recognized him, but turned away. None approached. John understood. It wasn't hatred, it was fear. Fear of being pulled into something uncomfortable. At his age, he no longer needed apologies, only a respectful glance. But even that was absent this morning. He sat down by the bank, the damp grass soaking through his pant legs, and opened the box. Inside was only ash, yet to him, it was laughter, letters from boot camp, the scent of sweat from a boy who had grown up too soon. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply, letting the smells of water, earth, and ashes mingle, as if his son were still sitting beside him, legs swinging over the water, laughing softly. A drop of dew landed on the back of his hand and melted instantly. He couldn't tell if it was dew or a tear. Rest easy, Marine, he whispered, his voice now firm, forged in fire and grief. He closed the lid, tightened his grip around the box, and rose. The first rays of morning sunlight struck the small pendant around his neck, a worn trident, the emblem of his years beneath the sea. John ran his thumb over it like touching an old oath, never leave a brother behind. The truck engine rumbled again, releasing a thin plume of smoke into the cold air. John turned away, leaving behind the silent water and the shadow of the old willow. But in his pale gray eyes there was still light, the kind that remains only in those who have lost everything except their dignity. And just as he took his final steps away from the shore, a voice sliced through the morning air, sharp, cold, and unmistakably familiar from the day before. "Not you again." Karen's voice sliced through the quiet morning air like the edge of a knife. John stopped where he stood. He turned slowly, the wooden box still held firmly in his hands. Mist clung to his silver hair, and in his tired eyes there was no anger, only the weight of weariness. Karen approached her heels, sinking into the damp ground, followed closely by a young security guard, whose uniform looked too new, his gaze wavering between obedience and conscience. "I thought I made myself clear yesterday," she said, her voice cutting sharper than the wind. John lifted the box slightly, his voice calm and deliberate. "I'm not here to fish. Just 10 minutes for my son." Karen's lips curled into a thin, disdainful smile. "Do I look like I care about your personal problems?" The lake fell silent. A few fishermen froze mid-motion. They knew this man, the one who had fixed their boats, found their lost dogs, and taught their children to tie fishing knots. But this morning no one dared to step forward. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of wet earth and the faint slap of water against the bank. John stood in the middle of it all, still as a monument. He set the box down by his feet, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, the posture of a soldier waiting for orders. Karen crossed her arms, tilting her head. "Get him out of here. This is private property." Her voice echoed, struck the water, and broke apart like a wound reopening. The young guard hesitated, his voice trembling. "Sir, I'm sorry. Orders are orders." John met his eyes, the look dry and hollow like barren earth. "Fine." One word, sharp, heavy, dropped like a stone into the lake. He bent down, picked up the box, and brushed off the thin layer of dirt from its lid, as if he didn't want his son to witness what was happening. Around him, the others remained motionless. A few lowered their heads, pretending to busy themselves. One man reeled in his line too quickly. No one spoke. No one looked him in the eye. Karen sighed, feigning boredom, her voice cold and dismissive. "And don't come back! Veterans like you think your service entitles you to something. It doesn't. You're not welcome here." John tilted his head slightly, but said nothing. Only a few drops of mist fell from his hair onto his shoulder and disappeared into the water by his boots. He turned away. Each step he took sounded deep and heavy, heavier than any gunfire he'd ever heard in combat. His figure faded slowly into the fog, leaving only the image of a weathered jacket and boot prints pressed deep into the wet grass. Behind him, the crowd stayed silent. A small boy, Tommy, the one John had once taught to fish, gripped his rod tightly. His lips quivered, ready to speak, but his father's hand landed gently on his shoulder. "Don't get involved in grown-up matters." Tommy lowered his head, and in that child's eyes, the seed of shame began to grow. John reached his truck, opened the door, and set the wooden box gently on the seat beside him. Sitting behind the wheel, he didn't start the engine right away. His gaze met the rearview mirror where the lake shimmered faintly through the mist, the same lake that now held his son's ashes. He whispered, barely audible, "You see, son, some battles never end." The old engine coughed to life, its rasping growl like the sigh of a tired soldier. The truck rolled forward, leaving deep tracks carved into the damp earth tracks that felt like the last footprints of patience. At the lakeside, Karen turned her back, brushing invisible dust off her sleeve. Yet for a fleeting second, she felt a presence, a gaze that pierced her to the bone. She looked around. No one was there. Only the gray sky and the rhythmic slap of water against the wooden dock, steady as a distant drumbeat. No one knew that just a few hours later, that sound would be drowned out by the rumble of military engines and the footsteps of men who still walked with the weight of discipline and justice, John Matthews' brothers-in-arms returning to Willow Lake. The next dawn, Willow Lake lay beneath a thin shroud of mist, like a burial cloth left behind by the night. The birds hadn't begun to sing when the ground trembled softly with the low roar of 3 black SUVs rolling into the parking lot. Mud-splashed tires turned slowly, and the vehicles stopped in perfect unison before the wooden gate where a new sign was being hung, "Exclusive members only." Karen stood among a few workers, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, her tone sharp and self-assured. "Make sure the letters are clear. I don't want anyone misunderstanding." Her voice carried that practiced authority of someone who had never truly earned it. But when the engines went silent, the air around her shifted, heavy, still waiting. The doors opened. 6 men stepped out, all in plain clothes, dark shirts, khaki pants, nothing that marked them as soldiers. But the way they moved told another story. They didn't need uniforms to be recognized. Their steps were measured, their posture straight, their eyes scanning every corner of the place with the discipline of men who had once walked through fire. The man in front was in his 50s, skin bronzed by years in the sun, a faint scar crossing his jaw. He stopped in front of Karen, eyes steady and unflinching, as though assessing unfamiliar terrain. "Good morning. We're looking for John Matthews." The voice was calm, but each word landed with the precision of an order. Karen hesitated, then quickly straightened her posture and forced a polite smile. "He's not welcome here anymore." The words were soft, almost casual, yet when they hit the ground, they felt as heavy as lead. The 6 men exchanged glances. No one spoke. Their expressions hardened, and the quiet between them carried more force than shouting ever could. One, tall, with silver streaks in his hair, clenched his fist so tightly that the joints cracked. It wasn't anger, but the silence of men who had seen what it meant to insult honor. Karen felt her throat tighten. She tried to break the tension with a nervous laugh. "I'm the new owner of this property. If you're interested, I could offer you our premium membership." The man with the scar lifted a hand, a simple gesture that stopped her mid-sentence. "That won't be necessary." His eyes never left the word exclusive carved on the wooden sign. Around the lake, a few townspeople had stopped to watch. Some recognized the stance, upright, unmoving, unyielding as steel. A gust of wind swept through, shaking the new sign until it knocked against the post with a hollow thud. One of the men bent down and picked up a discarded soda cap from the grass. He turned it in his fingers, staring toward the lake, his gaze distant, as though seeing the image of someone who had once sat there every morning for 20 years. He didn't have to say it aloud. They all understood why they were there. From afar, a young worker whispered, They look like soldiers." No one answered, but suddenly it felt as if the whole area had stopped breathing. The man with the scar took a step closer to Karen. His voice dropped low, just enough for her to hear. "He saved my life." Karen blinked. Her fingers tightened around her coffee cup until the lid popped off, spilling hot liquid down her wrist, yet she didn't even flinch. No one laughed. No one made a move. The 6 men stood firm, silent as stone pillars shrouded in mist. The first rays of dawn broke through, casting thin bands of light across the lake reflections, like 1,000 invisible metals rising from the water's depths. The old fishermen, the ones who had stood by silently when John was thrown out, now watched from a distance. One man leaned toward another and whispered, "Maybe we should stay. See what happens." The sky brightened. Karen swallowed hard and forced a strained smile. I don't understand what you're trying to say." The gray-haired man placed a hand on the scarred man's shoulder. A single nod passed between them. Then they turned toward the lake, eyes fixed on the thick veil of mist that still hung above it. In that moment, Karen saw something in their gaze, not anger, not threat, but a deep, wordless grief, the kind that makes every explanation meaningless. They didn't need weapons nor words. Their silence alone made the entire lakeside hold its breath. And then the man with the scar spoke again, his voice quiet but steady. "He deserves better than this." The words drifted into the wind, but lingered long enough for everyone nearby to lower their heads. Karen looked down at her hand. The coffee had gone cold, and for the first time she felt something she hadn't felt in years, shame. Through the heavy stillness came a new sound, the creak of another car door opening, the crunch of footsteps on gravel, and a deep, commanding voice rising above the silence, signaling the arrival of someone none of them expected. One of the men stepped forward, his shadow stretching long across the dew-soaked ground. His voice rose deep, firm, carrying the unmistakable weight of command. "Not welcome, Commander John Matthews, led SEAL Team 6 through Desert Storm." Karen froze. The polite smile on her face turned to stone. The workers stopped what they were doing, a few dropping their tools. The air grew so thick that everyone could almost hear their own heartbeat. The man took another slow step closer, his gaze cutting straight through her. "He saved me. Carried me 3 miles after I took shrapnel." He paused, pressing a hand to his chest where the old wound still lived beneath the fabric. "The man you threw out is a hero." Karen's face drained of color. Her hands clenched involuntarily, every excuse she had dying somewhere in her throat. There was nothing left to say when arrogance was laid bare beside honor. Another man came forward, older, his voice rough and trembling slightly, yet every word sharp and clear. "That quiet old man you insulted. Rescued 17 hostages during the embassy crisis. Never spoke about it. never bragged. The words fell heavy into the silence. More people gathered, drawn by the gravity of the moment. Those who had stood by watching John be humiliated the day before now lowered their heads, their indifference replaced by shame. A young father holding his son's small hand stepped out of the crowd. His voice shook with regret. He helped my family last year when our car broke down. He stayed for hours, never asked for anything. And I said nothing yesterday. Karen turned, looking desperately for a friendly face, but found none. Every pair of eyes had turned away from her, all fixed instead on the empty wooden chair where John used to sit and fish. The little oak chair, weathered by sun and rain, now stood as the silent center of 100 bowed heads. The gray-haired man took one more step forward, eyes reflecting the soft ripples of Willow Lake. You know what kind of man he is, he asked, voice hoarse. He didn't just fight wars. He spent his retirement building scholarships for veterans' children. 32 kids got to college because of him. A long sigh spread through the crowd like a wave. An elderly woman among the fishermen raised a trembling hand to her mouth, tears spilling freely. Others nodded, each remembering some small kindness, a fixed engine, a found dog, a shared meal, the quiet generosity no one thought to mention until now, when it was almost too late. Karen took a step back, her voice breaking. I didn't know. The man with the scar on his jaw answered simply, not angry, just profoundly sad. Of course you didn't. Men like him don't wear their medals to go fishing. The words cut through the last fragments of pride like a blade, stripping away the pretense and leaving only emptiness where arrogance once stood. The air by the lake changed. One by one, people removed their hats. Heads bowed. The wind carried with it the scent of watergrass and shame. Karen lowered her eyes, her cold cup of coffee trapped between her fingers. For the first time, she understood the true weight of a single word, dignity. A Navy man stepped forward and placed his faded cap on the wooden step by John's fishing spot. He earned his peace here. You took it from him. No one spoke after that. Willow Lake fell completely silent. The breeze across the water sounded like the soft breathing of old souls returning home. Those who had been silent yesterday now stood in a long row, heads bowed, a wordless apology carried by the wind. Karen remained where she was, surrounded by the circle of silence, and realized she had just come face to face with the one kind of power that cannot be bought, the respect of men, who once chose to die so that others might live. And then, from the far end of the line of cars, a man stepped out, dressed in a navy blue suit, posture, straight hair, white as frost, his eyes bright as steel. When he spoke, every sound around the lake stopped. It was the voice of a man that an entire generation had once stood at attention to hear. From the back of the crowd, a figure stepped forward. The early sunlight glinted off the silver insignia pinned to his chest. His navy blue suit was perfectly pressed, his tie neat, and every step he took carried the quiet authority of a man long accustomed to standing before a line of soldiers. Admiral James Peterson retired. He announced, his voice deep and steady. John Matthews served under me for 15 years. When I heard how he was treated here, I came myself. Karen flinched, her arms falling limp at her sides. Her eyes darted away from him, as if afraid to meet his gaze. No one in the crowd dared to breathe. The wind rustled softly through the trees, a sound like the whispers of old souls. The Admiral took one more step forward and pulled a folder from his leather briefcase. His voice was calm, not loud, but every word carried the weight of both law and honor. This land's deed includes a veteran covenant signed in 1952. Denying access to any veteran is illegal. He paused, looking directly at Karen. You didn't just break a rule, Ms. Westfield. You broke the promise this town once made to its soldiers. Karen accepted the folder with trembling hands. The rustle of paper sounded unnaturally loud in the stillness. The bold letters blurred before her eyes under the glare of the sun. She couldn't form a single word. The man with the scar along his jaw, the one who had said John saved his life, stepped forward, his voice gravelly. He led SEAL Team 6 into places we weren't supposed to survive. We followed him because he never once turned his back on anyone, friend or enemy. Another man added, his tone filled with quiet pride. He was the kind who stayed behind until everyone got home. That's the man you humiliated. Their words fell like hammers, not echoing but settling into a silence so heavy it seemed to press against the air itself. Karen tried to speak, her voice cracking. I didn't know. I never meant to. The Admiral interrupted, not in anger, but in sorrow. You didn't care to know. That's worse. A gust of wind picked up and the nearby American flag began to flap loudly, its rhythm echoing across the water. Admiral Peterson turned to the crowd. His voice softened, each word deliberate like an oath. Commander Matthews is one of the finest men I've ever served with. He's earned peace the kind no one has the right to take away. Around the lake, heads bowed. A few elderly veterans raised their hands in salute. Tommy, the little boy who had once learned to tie fishing knots from John, squeezed his father's hand and whispered, "He was my friend." His father said nothing, only tightened his grip. Karen looked down at the lake. Her reflection wavered, blurred between sunlight and tears. Her voice was barely audible. "Please, tell him he's welcome here. Free of charge. Any time." The Admiral shook his head slowly. "We didn't come here to negotiate his return. We came to remind you this place belongs to those who built its peace with their blood." No one spoke after that. The wind rose again, catching the sign that read, "Exclusive members only." It creaked once, then fell, the wood splitting against the ground with a dry crack. A young worker hesitated, then bent down to pick it up. After a moment, he set it aside carefully, almost reverently, as if cleaning up a mistake that should never have been made. The Admiral turned back to his men. They nodded in silent understanding, then raised their hands in unison, 6 crisp salutes cutting through the morning air. In that moment, Willow Lake was no longer a leisure spot. It had become an invisible monument to honor. Karen stood there, small and lost amid the scene. In her eyes, the blue of the water slowly blended with the silver of the light, reflecting the image of the man she had driven away, the quiet soldier, who had never asked for anything but respect. Admiral Peterson sighed softly, his gaze drifting toward the narrow dirt road leading out of the lake. He spoke under his breath, almost to himself. "Find him. Bring him home." The 6 men turned back toward their vehicles. Engines roared to life, the sound merging with the wind, a symphony of justice, wordless, but full of reverence. And as the sun climbed higher, the people of Willow Lake began to move without instruction, without discussion, all heading toward the same destination, the small country road leading to the quiet house where John Matthews had lived in solitude for so many years. The next morning, Willow Lake was crystal clear, as if it had never witnessed a confrontation at all. Hundreds of townspeople stood silently along both shores. No one spoke. No one had to. They were waiting for one man. From afar came the low rumble of an old pickup truck. When John Matthews's weathered silver truck came to a stop, every whisper faded into stillness. He opened the door and stepped out slowly, steadily, his posture as straight as it had been in the service. On his collar gleamed a small insignia, an anchor crossed by a trident, the emblem of the SEALs catching the morning light. A veteran in the crowd quietly said, "Attention." In an instant, everyone straightened up. Townsfolk, former soldiers, even children all stood solemnly. No one commanded them yet, the entire lake seemed to hold its breath. John stopped at the water's edge, the very spot where he had once been humiliated and cast out. His eyes swept across the familiar faces, the young father, little Tommy, the fisherman who once avoided his gaze. They stood there now silent, their eyes carrying the apology their words could not. Karen stepped out from the crowd, holding something small in her hands. She walked slowly, each step heavy with guilt. When she reached him, she lifted both hands. Resting in her palms was an old wooden float, the letters faint, but still legible, J. Matthews. Spot 17. Her voice trembled. "I removed it. I was wrong." John looked at the float and smiled gently. There was no trace of anger in his eyes, only the quiet peace of a man who had learned that true victory is never born from vengeance. Softly, in a low but steady voice, he said, "Keep it. Let it remind you. Peace is something you earn." Karen bowed her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. She held the float against her chest as if it were a sacred promise. Turning to the crowd, John spoke slowly. "You don't owe me anything. Just remember, respect isn't a gift. It's a duty." A breeze swept across the lake, carrying the scent of water and the rustle of dry leaves. The gentle lapping of waves sounded like distant voices, comrades long gone calling from another time. The young father stepped forward, his voice breaking. "Sir, we're sorry. We should have stood up for you." John placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "You stand up now. That's what matters." Little Tommy raised his hand in a crisp military salute. John chuckled softly and returned the gesture, slow, steady, deliberate. The crowd remained still. One by one, others raised their hands to their brows. The moment stretched on in perfect, reverent silence. No one clapped. No one cheered. Only reverence spread quiet but deep, stronger than any applause. An old soldier wept openly, tears falling onto a faded uniform. A woman gripped her husband's hand and whispered, "That's what honor looks like." John knelt and touched the surface of the lake. "This lake has seen enough shame," he said softly. "Let it see peace again." He looked up, his gaze reaching far across the shimmering water where sunlight danced like hundreds of smiling souls. Karen stepped closer, her voice barely more than a breeze. "How do you forgive so easily?" John met her eyes, kind but deep. "Because I remember what unforgiveness does to a man," he said. "It kills him long before the bullet does." The crowd fell silent again. Karen nodded, turned away, clutching the float as though it were a vow to herself. John sat down on the old chair, now returned to its rightful place. He opened his tackle box and took out a rusted fishing hook, the only thing left from the days he and his son had fished together. He cast the line into the water not to catch fish, but to let go of the last weight of memory. A soft breeze drifted in, carrying the scent of the distant sea. For a moment he thought he heard his son's voice. "You did good, Dad." John's smiled, eyes glistening, and whispered, "So did you, son." And as the sun reached the crown of the willow tree, those who remained quietly raised a new sign, not of iron, but of oak, carved with words the town would never forget. That morning the gates of Willow Lake glowed beneath the sunlight. A soft breeze drifted in from the water, carrying with it the scent of fresh grass and newly cut wood. On the ground, the tire marks from days before were still faintly visible. In their place now stood a new sign carved deep into oak, simple but proud, Lake Willow free access for all veterans. Beneath it, a few townspeople stood quietly, reading each word slowly, almost afraid to disturb something sacred. No one spoke, but every gaze turned in the same direction, toward the far shore where the still water mirrored the figure of an old man in a faded jacket. John Matthews sat there alone beside his weathered fishing rod. Sunlight fell across a face lined by time, yet his eyes held nothing but peace. His hand rested gently on the small wooden box at his side, the one bearing the name of the son who now lived only in memory. Each time the wind passed, ripples danced across the water as though the lake itself was answering him. Farther off, 6 men stood in formation along the grass. Dressed in plain clothes, their movements still carried the precision of years in uniform. When John lifted his head, they raised their hands in unison. 6 salutes, 6 pairs of eyes fixed on the man who had once led them through fire. The breeze carried a familiar sound, the steady flutter of the American flag. It hung high on a pole by the dock, its red, white, and blue reflected in the lake below, merging together like a quiet oath. Those who had fallen, and those who remained still, belonged to one another. Tommy, the little boy, who had once learned to tie fishing knots from John, stepped forward, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers bound by an old fishing line. He knelt and placed it gently on a stone by the shore, where the townsfolk had carved a simple inscription in honor of those who served and those who still remember. He stood at attention, a small hand rising to his brow, holding the salute for a long moment. A silver-haired seal walked over and stood beside John. He said nothing at first, only watched the water with him. After a few moments of silence, his gravelly voice broke softly through the breeze. "We thought we came here to honor you, John, but you're the one who reminded us what honor really means." John smiled faintly, not turning his head. "We just do what's right," he murmured. "The rest is noise." The 2 men stood together, watching as small waves lapped against the dock. Overhead, a flock of birds crossed the sky in a perfect arc, fading into the light. Behind them, laughter rang out, the sound of schoolchildren. A local teacher had brought a class to hear the story of the veteran of Willow Lake. The teacher read aloud from the new wooden sign, and the children clapped, but the adults did not. They only bowed their heads, knowing that some things cannot be celebrated with noise. John reeled in his line. The bait was untouched, but he didn't mind. He stood looking around. Everything felt simple again, the wind, the water, the people, all part of an unspoken promise between those who had fought for peace and those who were still living in it. Karen was there too, standing at the edge of the crowd, clutching the old wooden buoy he had told her to keep. When their eyes met, she nodded once. No words were needed. In that single glance, John saw that her redemption was complete. The wind rose, the flag billowed bright against the sun, and a soft tune from an old wind chime floated from the porch of the abandoned fishing club, a sound small and pure like the breath of the lake itself. John turned toward his truck. His figure grew smaller in the light, but each step he took remained steady, as if the road ahead still held a duty waiting to be fulfilled. Behind him, the crowd stood motionless. No one left before he did. A young soldier lowered his head and whispered, voice trembling against the wind, "Courage doesn't need a battlefield, only a heart that remembers." The lake shimmered, reflecting the flag, the saluting figures, the small bouquet of wildflowers. and the old chair where a quiet soldier had once found his peace. Brave veteran stories. We remember the quiet heroes,